Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and we are finishing up our semester of drugs and behavior by talking about therapeutic drug treatments for different types of psychological disorders. Now, based on the fact that we only have 2 weeks left in the semester, this will largely cover mood disorders and treatments, as well as anti-anxiety treatments. So we're not really going to have time for treatments for psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia. If you'd like to read more about those, you are more than welcome to do so at your leisure. But unfortunately, this is what we have time for. So we're going to start by talking about mood disorders, or as they're sometimes called, affective disorders. We'll talk about the different neural and chemical mechanisms behind mood disorders. And we will also talk a bit about neurobiological models of depression and drugs for treating mood disorders. So we're going to start by asking, well, what do we know about mood disorders? So mood disorders, by and large, are called mood disorders because they are marked by extreme mood. So one of the things that is becoming especially interesting in these current times is that there's been a bit of a debate about whether or not the feelings that you are feeling right now are largely a disorder, or are they a natural reaction to unforeseen and truly unique circumstances. So oftentimes you'll tend to find that psychiatrists who are medical doctors, they're more interested in classification, labeling systems, and things like that. They're going to be more likely to say that these are disorders, and the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in could be enough of a stressor to basically create a full-fledged mood disorder. Other researchers, particularly psychologists who believe in what we call a biopsychosocial approach, would say that these may not necessarily be considered clinical disorders because we are in unique circumstances, and feeling a bit depressed or anxious is entirely natural in these kind of circumstances. So whichever camp you tend to fall into, I think it's a very, very interesting debate. Let's kind of leave aspects related to the pandemic out of this and largely talk about what we know about mood disorders and how they are currently classified. So the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Disorders. It's developed by the American Psychiatric Association, and in addition to other types of affective disorders such as postpartum depression, as well as seasonal affective disorder, we're largely going to talk about two major types of affective disorders. We're going to talk about major depression, or unipolar depression, or major depressive disorder. These are recurring episodes of dysphoria, so feeling badly, and negative thinking. Now, compare that to something like bipolar disorder. This is a case where mood will swing from depression to mania. Type 1 bipolar disorder, those swings are often more extreme. With type 2, it's a little less extreme. Instead of having a manic episode, you are going to have what is called hypomania. We're going backwards. Now, sometimes depressed mood will occur in response to life events. I would say that a lot of the potential bad feeling that we're having could be a case of reactive depression. This is not technically viewed as mental illness. The symptoms may be a bit disproportionate to the event, or they may be a bit prolonged, but this is what we would consider a very natural reaction to events. If you have the loss of a family member or the loss of a job, you are going to feel a little bit depressed as a response, and maybe for a little while. And for the large part, that's only natural. It's when these start to become very maladaptive patterns that we start to notice that there might be a problem. So what is major depression? It's characterized by a loss of interest in nearly everything. So, for example, anhedonia, which basically means that you no longer have a sense of pleasure to things. This is also characterized by hopelessness, sadness, worthlessness, guilt, and desperation. And at worst, it can lead to suicidal ideation. For those with depression, about 7 to 15% die by suicide, compared to about 1 to 1.5% in the general population. So if you go to your book on page 398, major depressive disorder will include things like depressed mood occurring daily and for most of the day, anhedonia and disinterest. And here's what's really critical. If you start finding that this disinterest or anhedonia is not just occurring for things you don't like, but also things that you really love, that you consistently make time for, that's going to be a really bad sign. We can have a change in body weight, such as a gain or loss, changes in sleep patterns, either insomnia and not sleeping enough or sleeping too much, hypersomnia, fatigue, loss of energy, that feeling of worthlessness and guilt. You may have a little bit of brain fog, difficulty thinking and making decisions, and potentially suicidal ideation. Now, in addition to the other depressive disorders that I've already mentioned, your book also mentions what we call a persistent depressive disorder. It used to be referred to as dysthymia or dysthymic disorder. This is basically a depressed mood that occurs nearly every day for 2 years. And additionally, you have to have at least 2 symptoms that I kind of listed for depressive disorder. Now, compare that to major depressive disorder. You basically have to have at least 5 of those symptoms within a 2-week period. So I think that that's kind of interesting. So there have been some times where I can look back on situations that I was having and not really think of myself as being depressed, but I remember being in a funk for maybe a month or 2, and maybe that could be characterized as depression, but I think it really depends on the person. So here are some of those symptoms of manic episodes as well as major depression. We'll talk about the manic episodes later. So as I kind of mentioned, 5 or more of the following symptoms present during a 2-week period. They represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms has to be either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. So depressed mood nearly most of the day, nearly every day, either through a subjective report or an observation, diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain, and that's maybe a change of more than 5% in a month, insomnia or hypersomnia, psychomotor agitation, so moving too much, or psychomotor retardation, moving a lot less, so restlessness or feeling slowed down, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or guilt, brain fog, suicidal ideation. These have to cause clinically significant distress or an impairment in functioning, so they have to be maladaptive, and it can't be attributable to a medical condition or different types of drugs. Now, these can be comorbid with anxiety and alcohol abuse in particular. Research does find that the comorbidity is estimated at almost 60%. Generally, this is quite common with anxiety disorders. Oftentimes, we're going to find that for people that have comorbidities, an anxiety is usually going to precede depression, and it's either usually going to be generalized anxiety disorder, which is marked by a lot of free-floating anxiety where the anxiety doesn't really have a very specific situational target. Or it could be social anxiety, where we spend a lot of time worrying about what people think. So anxiety is actually kind of interesting. There are, I can see where anxiety kind of may precede something like depression when you spend a lot of time worrying, and that can be really depleting on your energy and things like that. I typically tend to characterize anxiety as being very similar to depression in a lot of ways. There may be an unhappy mood there, but anxiety is often characterized by a lot of energy in a way that depression is really not. And that comorbidity, especially if it's anxiety or alcohol abuse, will often predict more severe symptoms. These episodes of depression will typically last about 6 to 9 months. They often can have remission on their own. So most of these episodes do go away on their own. I would recommend that if you're struggling with depression, going and seeking help for that through therapy, for example, may help speed that remission along and give you better tools and coping mechanisms. But a lot of people do find that these do recur throughout life. So what are the major demographics of mood disorders? The risk for depression is slightly higher for women than it is for men. We do know that in general, mood disorders and anxiety disorders, they tend to be experienced more by women than by men. That could be because we typically underreport both of those disorders in men. And it's also potentially because, especially with something like depression, occasionally it does manifest itself differently for men than it does for women. Men are a lot more likely to experience depression as actual physical body pain rather than a depressed mood or something like that. So there could be some socialization there. If men are kind of socialized to not really talk about feelings or manage their feelings or seek help for those disorders, they're not going to be diagnosed with it. But it could be biological differences as well. Generally, for affective disorders, the mean age for onset is about 27, but that has decreased in recent years. And we do actually find that Americans in particular are developing major depression at higher rates and at younger ages than previously have been reported. And some of that could be due to aspects related to social media, greater screen time, and a variety of different aspects. And just in general, life is a lot more stressful these days than I think it used to be. So here you can kind of see some data. We have our cumulative rates for major depression. So here we have our age of onset. So you kind of can see that early on, so here we kind of have 1920s and 1930s and prior to 1905, you can kind of see that age of onset and that cumulative index is very, very low, especially for people prior to the 1940s. And I can definitely tell you that part of the reason that these may not have been reported is that in general, people from previous generations, particularly boomers and earlier, they are less apt to want to talk about their psychological issues. Oftentimes, they will regard those as being very personal, or they may not necessarily have had the upbringing or the understanding that these things can be problems. I've had instances where I have occasionally talked about very openly about the panic attacks or the anxiety attacks that I have suffered with older adults, and occasionally they have referred to me as being too personal for sharing that information. That's just not the kind of skill set that they were brought up with. They didn't talk about those things. In contrast, I tend to find that especially for Generation Z and later millennials, which are largely all of you, you tend to be a lot more open about these things, and you've always been very, very open to hearing about people talk about their struggles with those. Notice too that especially after 1945 and 1955, you can actually see that the age of onset, that cumulative index, is getting much, much higher, and it's tending to get higher at a younger age of onset. So bipolar disorder is going to be a little bit different. It includes instances and periods of major depression, but it also has alternating manic episodes. The primary symptom of a manic episode or of mania is elation, very, very high energy. They don't require much sleep. They have a high sense of confidence. And really, this is critical. So we're not just talking about somebody who is bouncy or has a lot of energy. We are talking about somebody who is engaging in a lot of risky, impulsive behavior. So it's like this energy, but it does have a negative edge to it. So this may include things like pathological gambling, risky, promiscuous sex, and a variety of different things. So here are the symptoms of manic episodes. So it's a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy, lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day, or any duration if hospitalization is required. There can be periods of psychosis with more severe manic episodes. During the period of mood disturbance and increased energy or activity, 3 or more of the following symptoms, 4 if the mood is only irritable, are present to a significant degree and represent, and this is critical, a noticeable change from usual behavior. So that'll include inflated self-esteem, potentially delusions of grandeur, decreased need for sleep, more talkative than usual or greater pressure to keep talking. We have this constant racing thought or flight of ideas, distractibility, either reported or observed, an increase in goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation, excessive involvement in activities with a high potential for painful consequences. So here's where that impulsivity comes in, buying sprees, sexual indiscretions, business investments, gambling, etc. And again, we are going to see that this will cause harm in day-to-day functioning, and potentially even needing hospitalization to prevent self-harm or psychotic features. And again, it can't be due to a drug or another medical condition. So this is not just bouncy, energetic mood. This is very, very high mood with a lot of energy, less need for relaxation and repair, and a lot of irritable impulsivity. So what causes different types of mood disorders? And there is an interaction between genes and environment here, and there's very, very strong evidence for a genetic component. So we do find this with adoption studies. So we do find that children that are adopted are more likely to develop a mood disorder if their biological parents suffered from a mood disorder. These things do tend to run in families. And we also find this with twin studies. If one identical or monozygotic twin has a mood disorder, the likelihood of the other twin having it is about 65%, which is a pretty high concordance rate. For our fraternal twins, which are basically ordinary siblings, the rate is actually going to be only about 20%. And we'll find that this is true for ordinary siblings as well. My sister actually occasionally struggles with depressive episodes. She also has as we just found out maybe a month or two ago, she does have issues related to anxiety. I have occasionally wondered if there have been instances where I've struggled with depression, but I don't think it was enough to really impair my daily functioning. But I can tell you that I have a lot of nervous energy that fits really well with the anxiety disorder that I know I have. So we'll talk some more about mood disorders in our next video.